Hey everybody, thank you for making it to the first session block of the day. You're the true heroes at this point. So we're going to talk about Storybook, an interactive pattern library for your decoupled applications. The link at the bottom will take you to a GitHub repository that is the project that we'll be using for examples. These slides aren't up there yet, but they will be, and I'll tweet them out. But the actual storybook we're going to be playing around with is, so some useful resources there. All right, so I am Brian Perry. I am an interactive developer at a company called HS2 Solutions. I live in the Chicago suburbs. Probably a pretty popular opinion here at Design for Drupal, but I'm a lover of all things component-based and all component-based approaches. Building with components in Drupal, using pattern libraries like Pattern Lab to prototype components, and then increasingly taking a component-based approach, building in JavaScript frameworks like React. And then I'm also a lover of all things Nintendo, so if you want to talk about the cool things you're playing on your Switch, track me down.
Zelda.
And what was that?
Zelda.
Yes, Zelda forever. I'm, I think, 125 hours into Zelda. Maybe not something I should admit on a video ever, but... and then I'm on the internet in a bunch of different places and would love to internet with you. So, as I mentioned, I work at a company called HS2 Solutions. We have a couple of offices in the Chicago area. I work with a great team of Drupal folks. Drupal is one of a handful of things that we do at HS2, but I get to learn so much from the people that I work with, and I would say that if you're looking to do great Drupal work, we're often hiring, and if you're looking to have great Drupal work done, I'm sure I can get you in touch with somebody. And then the other thing that I forgot to mention is that I'm really excited to be here because I used to live in the area. I grew up in Cranston, Rhode Island, and lived in Waltham for about 5 years and spent a lot of time around here. I worked part-time at MIT for a while and used to perform at Improv Boston down the street. So it feels like home here. It's awesome. Okay, so diving in. So this is the kind of generic example representing the atomic design approach from the Pattern Lab page. How many people here use Pattern Lab? I guess use Pattern Lab. Just a few, okay. And do you use it with Drupal projects of those people? Just one, two. Interesting. Okay, cool. So Pattern Lab is a tool that's popular in the Drupal community and elsewhere, but gives you a development environment to build components and prototype them, and then it can be integrated with Drupal in some interesting ways. It's possible to have Drupal integrate with your components in your pattern library so that Drupal can use them. But it's a great way to experiment and build these things in isolation before necessarily they fully exist on the Drupal side of things. And Pattern Lab has a Twig version, so it works nicely with Drupal. And I've used that on a lot of the projects that I've done in Drupal 8. It's a big part of my workflow at this point. But as I started getting comfortable with some of the JavaScript frameworks that are really highly focused on components, especially React, that's the one that I play around with the most at this point, I wondered, okay, how do I kind of incorporate that approach to development into what I'm doing in React? So there are a handful of different options there, but one that's very popular is called Storybook, and that's what we're going to talk about today. It's an interactive development environment for your UI components. So for those that are familiar with Pattern Lab, it shares some similarities, but then also takes advantage of some of the interactivity you can have within your JavaScript applications in some interesting ways. So, as I mentioned, there are a handful of different options, but one of the great things about Storybook is it has a wide array of support for different frameworks. We're going to talk about React today. The examples that we're going to go through are using React, but it has support for Vue and Angular as well, and a lot of the concepts are similar. So if that's not your framework of choice, or some other cool hit framework comes out tomorrow. I'm sure Storybook will eventually support it as well. And it has a nice set of add-ons that do some cool things. We'll look at some examples of add-ons. For those who have used Pattern Lab, I think Pattern Lab calls them plugins maybe, but there's similar concepts in Pattern Lab, but the array of add-ons for Storybook are wider. And then also it can help facilitate some of your UI testing with some of these tools, but also, I mean, in general, I think that kind of comes along with these JavaScript frameworks. They're very testable, and Storybook can help there too. So where we'll start is actually just looking at some examples that are out there on the web. The first one we'll look at is a site called PartC, which is a pretty cool website. It's a art community site to support artists, help them make money off of their art, and also looking at their example storybook and browsing around on GitHub, they're definitely doing some cool open source stuff as well. So they have their whole website here in their GitHub repository. If we go over to artsy.net here and just look at their site, I think the bulk of this is in React, but you know, it looks like a website. You can kind of pick out different components there. There's this nice little slideshow. We see representations of different artworks. We can drill into something and see detail for the art and different kind of components in the sidebar here, contact form. There's also a magazine portion of the site that has different articles that might be interesting to artists. A nice article layout here. So that's what the site looks like. And then they also have their storybook online as well. So if we go here, this is Artsy's storybook. So we see a set of components on the left-hand side, and then in the main panel, the component itself, and we can interact with it. So this is the artist selector that's part of their onboarding process. I can search for Vincent van Gogh and see it come up in the list and highlight things and select them. If we go under publishing, we can see one of those article views that we saw before, standard article. So that article layout that we saw, so you can have individual components or larger composed layouts similar to what you can do in something like Pattern Lab. There's different variants for your components, so the top margin, truncated articles, etc., different ads in the sidebar, all that good stuff. And then down at the bottom, in this panel is where the add-ons display. So this one's called Scissors. And but what the Scissors add-on in this case lets you do is select different common device dimensions. So I can pick my fancy iPhone 10, and here I see the component at the iPhone 10 simulated device width, so I can rotate it. So that's a simple, useful example of an add-on there. So I just thought this was a cool storybook, cool that it's just out there publicly. It's pretty fully featured. I mean, there is a real great representation of, it seems like, most of the components on their site.
Pardon me, where's the entry point for this storybook? I'm not seeing it.
For that storybook?
Yeah.
Yeah, so in the Artsy GitHub, it's reaction.
Thanks.
And then it's, artsy.github.io/reaction. So let's look at just one more quick example. We can look at Uber React visualizations, because I know everyone unequivocally loves and supports Uber all the time. But another cool little storybook. This is a little bit more focused on particular components for visualization. So we see a chart here. We can look at a vertical bar chart. So it renders the component. A couple of cool add-ons here. There's a JSX add-on that lets you see the JSX that's used to render this component. And then there's another add-on called Nobs. And we'll actually, in some of the examples that we go through, we'll look at how you can add these knobs. And I'll also say the word knobs so frequently it will lose meaning, which will be fun. But what knobs let you do is make some of the props for your components configurable. So here we can uncheck the labels for the different axes and remove the grid lines and strip the component down just to the bars themselves. So some interesting ways you can see different variations of your components and what those are going to do. Yeah. So that's a couple of cool examples. So now let's talk about how we can use Storybook and how we can build some stories. So first, we'll talk about how you can add Storybook to a project. This example, I'll take it from the perspective of bootstrapping a new React app and then adding Storybook to it. But you could use the same approach to add Storybook to an existing project. So you can run npx with create React app to bootstrap your React app. So that's going to scaffold a React app for you, in this case in the my app project directory. And then if you can change into that directory, and you can run npx again with a specific package from the Storybook CLI called get Storybook. And if you haven't used npx, you might be familiar with the previous alternative to that is installing the package globally, and then you can use it. So you can install instead get Storybook globally and then just run get Storybook. We run that in your project, and that lets you run npm run Storybook. And when you do that, it's going to run a little dev server by default at this address for you, where you can go and see your Storybook that at this point isn't going to have a whole lot in it. One other common convention here, it's in the Storybook docs. Go back to full screen here. And this is the approach that I follow. So you can have individual story files that live next to your components in the same place. And the common convention there is component name.stories.js. So you can configure Storybook to get all of those stories.js files and add them in your Storybook. So to do that, you just need to, in the .storybook directory, which is a Storybook config directory, create a config.js file, and basically just copy and paste this thing in here. But you import configure from Storybook, and then there's a little regular expression basically to get those stories.js files, and it iterates through them and adds them to your Storybook. Again, this is something that's right in the documentation too. So we're going to look at a few examples here, kind of starting from something small and kind of building out from there. So the examples that we look at is from a Decoupled project that I've talked about elsewhere. There's a music discovery app. We'll look a little bit more at like what the app actually does. But we're just going to start with a small piece of it. This album component here. So it has, it's a row that has an album cover, the artist's name, the title of the album, and then we'll see here in the little source code panel that there's a render method here that is rendering out our JSX. There's the album, and then we're passing in some props. So the artist name, title, cover image URL. There's also a select album function that gets used when an album is selected. We're just mocking that in this case. Yeah, so that's what the component looks like, how you render it in JSX. So now that we've seen an example of it, how do we get that in our Storybook? So again, where the components live, in source/components in this project, we're creating an album.stories.js file. And then this is how we write our story. So we're going to import React, because we're not going to get too far without that. And then we're going to import stories of from Storybook. And then you need to obviously import the component that you're going to render. And then the next thing that we're doing here, we'll talk about it in a bit, but the album list is a component that we're going to wrap this album in. they really just add some additional formatting. It's what Storybook calls a decorator. It lets us just render this component a little bit more cleanly in the Storybook in this case. So then, what we need to do is have some data that we can pass into this component, especially because at the lower level here, this is really just a functional component. It takes in props, doesn't really know much about itself, so it somehow needs to get data fed to it. In the app, it's getting state from the app, but here, we need to mock that. So what we're doing here is we're creating an object that has basically all the props that we need to pass into our component, and then the values we want to feed into it. So we have data for Kendrick Lamar's album here, and we're also exporting this example album variable. It's a pattern that I've seen with Storybook. So this is just one simple object that represents an album, and there's other places where we're going to render albums in our Storybook. So rather than having to keep mocking the album, we can export it so we can import it in other stories. And now we finally get to the part of defining our story. So we say stories of, and then the name of the component, which is album. And then the next line is that decorator thing that I mentioned. So the album itself is a list item, but it's usually rendered inside an ordered list. So by wrapping it in this album list, which is an ordered list, it gives it the number and just adds some additional spacing and formatting that makes it a little bit nicer and reflects reality a little bit more to see it. So the decorator in this case just lets you wrap your component in some additional JSX. We'll look at some other examples of decorators in a bit. And then we add the different variants of our story. So there's a default example. So give it a name, and then there's an arrow function that just renders the component. So we're rendering the album JSX there. And then we're just taking the example album object, and in the curly braces there, we're doing an object spread. You may or may not be familiar with that in ES6 or newer JavaScript. What that does is that just takes the example album object and just kind of blows it up. And lays out all of the different values of the object as props. As props in this case because we're passing it into the component, but just takes the artist name and cover image and everything and just passes that along to the component. So it's a nice clean convention there that I've seen in some Storybook tutorials. So you define the mock data and then you just use that object spread to pass it in. So then we have another variation. You can click on the album to make it active, and that is based on the active album prop, just a Boolean. So here, we say active, and then we render the album. We pass in the same object and spread it, but then we override it with the active album prop. So we don't want it to be false here, we want it to be true for this variant, so we just say active album true, and we're good to go.
What's the behavior from setting it to true? Sorry.
You'll see in a second.
All right.
Yeah.
It was a brilliant question.
Yeah, it's going to blow your mind. All right, so here's what the album story looks like, and we'll take a look at it here. So we see our album on the left-hand side, and it just renders the album with the data that we passed in. If we mouse over it, we see the little hover. But then we can look at the active, and it just highlights, gives a nice blue border. Like I said, mind-blowing. But that's the difference between those two variations. So you can represent all the variations that you have in your component. This one's really simple. And then if we look at the section down here, we have the concept of an action. So that's the first add-on we're going to look at here. So you can click this album, and you see that it's logging something here. So there is a function that gets passed in, as we mentioned, that does some stuff when you click on an album. And when we look at the larger app, we'll see a little bit more about what that actually does. But you do want to know if somebody's interacting with this, and also, if the component depends on it, you have to somehow mock that function. So actions is one way to do that. It lets you mock the functions, and then also lets you log the data that happens when you click on them. So we'll just look at a really simple example of that here. So if we want to add an action for clicking on the albums, we're going to use the Actions add-on. And this is the general process for adding add-ons. So you're going to install the dependency for your add-on. So npm install save dev storybook add-on actions in this case. And then one additional step is you have to register the add-on. So in that storybook configuration directory, you're going to add an addons.js file if one is not already there. And you really just have to import the register from the add-on. So one liner there. And as you add add-ons, you'll have a handful of them in that file. All right, so let's look back at our album.stories.js file and see how we layer the add-on of actions into them. So we're going to import the actions add-on so we can use it, import action from it. And then this is just another common convention I've seen that I think is pretty useful. It's probably overkill in this case because we just have one action, but we can also create an object for all of our actions. If you have a handful of functions that are passed in or functions that this component uses, you can create an object for all of them, and you can do that same object spread thing to keep it clean when you add your story. In this case, we just have one action. It's select album, and we're just mocking that function, and we just say action, and then a string of any kind. So I'll typically use the function name, or maybe the prop, and that's just what gets logged as we saw there. So I'm just saying select album when someone triggers the select album function. So now, looking back at where we add the different variants of the story, there's a couple of different examples here that do the same thing. So if you actually just wanted to pass in that select album prop, you could, in the curly braces, just actually say action select album, and that'll trigger that action. Or alternatively, since we defined the album actions, we can just also add that object spread there. So then when we do that, as we saw before, what's going on here? Full screen, maybe. There we go. Yeah. So when we click, it logs it, and we'll see when we see this component in larger composed components, we can get a little more useful information than just the same thing logged over and over, as we see here. So then this also uses the Nobs add-on. So we'll look at layering that on. But this lets you make things configurable like we saw before. So it's a cool way that you can experiment with different variations of the component. What if I had a really long album title? And then we added a little Boolean so we can trigger whether or not the album is active. And I can change the artist name, Kenny Powers. So we can just adjust the data live, see what sort of impact that has. For a simple component, we're really just seeing maybe if we can blow it out or do anything weird with it. But then in some of the examples that are a little bit more complicated, it can have some interesting impact. So let's see how we do that. So a lot of these conventions start to be pretty similar, but we're going to add the Nobs add-on to our story file, and then we're going to import with Nobs, which lets us use Nobs as a decorator in this case. And then there are different types of Nobs, like it's Boolean, text, number, object. So you're going to import the ones that you want to use in this case, and we just have text and Boolean here. And then when we define our story, we first need to add a decorator to tell the story that we're going to use Nobs. It just, I would imagine, is effectively wrapping the story, the component, in the things that it needs to be able to use Nobs. But we just say add decorator with Nobs, and then we can override the props that we want to make configurable. I'd like to think that you could also, there's got to be some way to add these knobs in the object that you define for the album data, but for whatever reason I haven't been able to figure that out quite yet. But this works. So I say artist, and then in the curly braces, it's just, since I want to use text, parentheses, a label, and a default value. Same thing for title, and then a Boolean for the active album. So now we have those configurable values that let us experiment with our component. All right, so that's some examples with a simple functional component. Let's dive into something a little bit higher level that composes some different components together. So we're going to look at the app itself. So this is a decoupled Drupal app. I've spoken about it at camps and cons before, so there's videos if you want to know more about the app. But it uses the Contenta distribution, actually Reservoir, technically, but to provide an API on the Drupal side. And it gets this cool data set from a Google spreadsheet that is an aggregation of all of the year-end best of lists, like a best of, and then provides these visualizations based on that data in React. So here we see the default cover view. So we see our album component, but it's a list of albums. We have 50 rows by default, but we can change the number of rows that are displayed. And then if we click on an album, we see that not only does it become active, but it changes what's displayed in the detail panel on the right-hand side. We see Lord's album cover. There's a link to go play the album on Spotify, and we can see where she ranks on the different lists and see what they have to say about it in Stereogum's best of the year list. And then, so in addition to, we can do things like filter here and all that good stuff. But with that same data set, there's a couple of other different visualizations. So if we click on the list tab here, it's going to use that same data set, but mount a different visualization component. This is a heat map that kind of shows, with 50 it gets kind of intense, but it shows where these albums show up across all of the different lists. So how commonly Kendrick Lamar ranked, things like that. It gets kind of fun when you filter it based on a particular list. And there's also a table visualization. So this is just a table, really similar to what was in the spreadsheet, but based on the same data set. And we can swap between all of those. So let's take a look at taking just this cover view visualization, since we're building out from the album component, and adding a story for that. So again, a lot of this stuff is going to start to look pretty similar. So we're importing the CoverView component. This is in coverview.stories.js in this case. And here we're mocking our data. There's, again, a bunch of different ways we could do this. We could actually create an object here that has a set of albums, or have like a dummy album that we compose into a larger data set. But in this case, since I have that API, I actually just got 10 rows of data as an object and stored it in a file in a data directory. So it's called 10 albums. There's just one variable that's exported called 10 albums, and it has 10 albums in it. So that lets us just say import 10 albums, and then we have a variable called 10 albums that we can use with these visualizations. So, still doing similar things that we did with the album component itself. So we're going to create an object for the data. So our albums is that 10 albums object. We're saying that there's going to be 10 rows because we have 10 albums. And then we're selecting the first album by default. And all these visualizations need that same sort of data passed into it. So we're going to export it here, so we can use it on the other visualizations if we want to create stories for them. And then this just has one action for selecting the album. It's actually not something that's used by the other visualizations. They don't have that prop, so we're not going to bother exporting it. This is just kind of an individual instance here. And then we add CoverView. and then we're going to say that we're going to use knobs, and all of this will look pretty similar here. So we're spreading out the visualization data, that action that we created, and we're going to make, through knobs, the rows and the selected album configurable. So now, if we look at our storybook, a lot of tabs, and go to our cover view, here it is. Looks like it does in the app, like we would expect. We've got 10 albums to play with. But based on that data that we pass into it, that mock data, it functions. So I can pick a different, actually, so it's only going to log the action. We'll see another example that does function. But by playing with some of the configurable values, you can get it to essentially function. But it's going to actually mock the select album function there. But you'll see, like, if I pick this album here, it's saying select album 4. It's the fourth portion of the array. So it gives you some data about what's actually being clicked on. But if I go into the knobs here, I can change the number of rows and see what it looks like when there's just 2 rows. But potentially more interesting, I can simulate what happens when you click on a different album. So I can say, I want to select album 2. And the component re-renders, and we see the Lord album selected, and all of the data for Lord in the panel on the right-hand side. So that's a component that has a handful of components together. But the interesting thing for me was, once we have this stood up, and we're smart about mocking some of our data, how easy it is to get the other visualizations in Storybook. So here's what that looks like. And again, since a lot of this is pretty similar, you guys are probably getting it at this point. But this is our ListView story. We're importing the ListView. And then since we exported that visualization data constant, we can just import it here, and we're good to go. We have something that we can pass into the ListView. And then the way we define stories is similar. There's a few different variations here, but so we have the default, and there's a control panel expanded prop. We'll see what that does, but that has some impact on how the visualization is displayed. We're making that configurable, and we have a couple of different variants that show what it's like with the control panel expanded or not expanded, and then also an example that shows with just one row, because this heat map can differ quite a bit based on that. But, because we already had that data queued up from the other story, really all we had to do was just define the different variations of this story, and we're off to the races. So here it is, ListView. We've got our default ListView, so it's that heat map that we saw before with 10 rows, and control panel expanded shrinks the size of the heat map. The way the control panel slides out on the left-hand side, this particular component needed to take account for that when the size of the container that it was in changed. But you can see what this visualization looks like when it's squished, which is pretty useful. Or change the number of rows. That's probably not going to be all that shocking here. Although I did, it's nice to know that if I pass in 15, it's not going to error out when it only has 10 rows. So you can test things like that. And then this is what it looks like with just one row. Not super attractive, but good to see what an example of that looks like. And then we'll take it to the album table. So that was just the table view that we had. It's even simpler here. We just import the component, import the visualization data that we have. There's really only one variant that seems to matter here. So we just pass in the visualization data. Doesn't have any actions that we care about. And we're just going to make the number of rows configurable. And then when we do that, album table here, here's our table. And we can also try to break it here and say, what happens if we have 30 rows? Handles it pretty gracefully. Just expands the height of the component. So good to know that it does that. Cool. So in kind of starting from a small component and building out, As you get some of the conventions there, it gets pretty easy to reuse that data. But I also asked myself while working on this and putting it together, like, how far can this go? Can we just mount the app here? And the answer is yes. So this is actually what it looks like. It's just 7 lines. So the app itself has all the state for the app in this case, so it knows a lot, it has all the functions that we need. It also actually goes and hits an API to get its data, so we don't even have to mock data here. It's just the full app component, and it works. It's just rendering React here. So import React, Storybook, the app component itself, and we just add a story for it and render app. And then when we do that, lo and behold, it works. So if we click on default here, just like we saw in the app itself, we'll spin it while it gets its data, but the whole entire app is here with 50 results, and we can pick any one of them, and we can filter here. It's the whole thing there. So I just thought it was interesting that you can do that. And I think that there is definitely a use for that. The real value of Storybook, I think, is building these components in isolation and composing them together and starting with something small and building out like that. But especially for like a functional app that has a storybook like this, it's nice to be able to compare these components in isolation, maybe some of the weird things you do with them, with what's possible in the app. So I think it's useful. Or at least just cool that it's possible. So we still have a little bit of time here. Let's talk about testing. I mentioned that there's some things that make these storybooks nice and testable, and just React in general is very testable. The few that I've used are both part of the StoryShots package. So StoryShots does Jest, which is a testing framework that ships with Create React App, snapshot testing. And we'll look more at exactly what that means. But a snapshot in that case is really a snapshot of the markup that gets rendered for your component. And then there's also StoryShots Puppeteer, which uses headless Chrome Puppeteer to do visual regression testing. I think that package is a little bit early and experimental, but it's pretty cool. And then a tip here is that being smart about the data that you mock and making it exportable can help inform these tests, can help inform regular like Jest unit tests. So just being smart about that mocking can really help with your testing in general. And then there's another add-on that I've seen that I really haven't been able to get too deep into called Specs, or the full name is Storybook Addon Specifications. And that lets you have like your unit tests represented in Storybook. I just haven't gotten all the way into it yet, but worth checking out. So let's look at a snapshot, StoryShot test here. So we need to, in the source directory, add a storybook.test.js file. This also assumes, in this case, that we bootstrapped our app with Create React App, so we already have Jest and all the things that we need to run Jest. But you would basically, in the examples that we look at, you'd basically pick one of these approaches, but I just wanted to show a handful of them all in one place. So you're going to import the package so you can use it, import StoryShots, or if you wanted to use the image snapshot, you would import that. If you just wanted to do a default StoryShots, which is just going to take a snapshot of all of your components, you would just say init StoryShots, and you're good. You can also do things like specify which stories you do or don't want to include in the snapshot. I actually did that in this storybook that we've been playing around with. The app is one that I added this little demo phrase to so that it excludes it via this regular expression. But because it goes out and hits the API, that right now doesn't work very nicely with StoryShots. Maybe there's a way to work around that I just haven't had the chance to get into. And then that table view I believe uses an API that's like a known issue with this snapshot approach that it doesn't support today, so I filtered that one out too. Or if you instead wanted to do the image story shots, this is kind of the default example here. So you say the suite, and then the test is that image snapshot. So for the regular story shot, here's what the output looks like. It's just going to give you this list of all of your components, tell you about your test suite, and the test that passed. So if you change the markup of a component and run this again, or there's some sort of bug that causes something different to be rendered, these tests would fail, which is great. Just so you can get a feel for like what this is really doing and what this is actually covering, here's an example of what the snapshot looks like. It's just a text file, and it has the rendered markup for the story. So just by looking at this, you can kind of get a feel for like, if a class name changes or something, or if the artist name that you passed in doesn't make it to the rendered output, like it would catch that. But if a component shifts over 5 pixels or something, it's not going to catch that. And this is an example of what the StoryShot Puppeteer visual regression testing output looks like. So I just took the artist name and title out of the component and reran my snapshot test, and it generates a visual regression image diff. So I see the before, the after, and the diff in the middle. Pretty nice. Deploying your storybook. So it's pretty easy. So again, this is covered nicely in the storybook documentation, but there's a command you can run, build storybook, and a couple options that you can pass to it. This example is going to export a bundle of your storybook to a .out directory. So you can run that manually. More commonly, you'd add it as a npm script. So you can, say npm run build storybook. It's going to create a production-ready bundle in the out directory, and you can host that pretty much anywhere. You can put it up on GitHub pages or wherever you like to put your statically bundled JavaScript. So that's really nice and easy. And then, since this is designed for Drupal, I did want to loop back to the Drupal world a little bit. It's really not more than an open question, but Storybook is really great for giving yourself a playground and style guide-like thing for your React components. It's a great tool. I use Pattern Lab a lot with Drupal. I've done different variations on decoupled projects, some that are fully decoupled, so you'd probably just be using Storybook in that case. Some that are progressively decoupled, so Drupal's going to handle some page rendering, Drupal's going to have some of its own components, and then there might be some React components sprinkled in, or Vue or Angular or whatever. So my question there was like, how does that work? Are we just going to use those separate tools? And I don't really know the answer. That might really be the best approach. You're going to have your Pattern Lab for your Drupal stuff and your Storybook for your React stuff in this case. But kind of thinking out loud here, one thing that Brad Frost, if you follow him, the atomic design dude, a project that he's been working on is this style guide concept. So he has a great blog post, if you haven't read it, about the concept of the storefront and the workshop. So it's the idea that something like Pattern Lab or something like Storybook is really a development tool. It's a place where you can experiment and prototype and break things, and maybe there are going to be things that are work in progress or don't look great. And then if sharing your style guide is something that's an important client deliverable or something that you post publicly, the idea of what he calls the storefront, which is a more polished, official version of your style guide. So he has a version of this for Pattern Lab that has Pattern Lab, and then Pattern Lab informs the style guide with this data in a nice, clean setup. And then he also recently released a React version that uses Storybook. So Storybook is the place where you can experiment, and then it uses Gatsby to take your components and do a static style guide for that. So A, I think that was interesting, but B, I wonder, given that there are both of those tools that take these rendered versions of these components and export them somewhere, I wonder if it might be possible to create a thing for a progressively decoupled app that has those two style guide bits in one place. I don't really know. Maybe it's too much work. Maybe it's a bad idea. But nothing better than ending a talk with an open question. So we have a little bit of time for questions if anybody has any. And if not, that was just, really fun, great time, way to spend a morning with everybody. No questions? One question. Yes?
Super minor question, but
sure, I'll take it.
I noticed that the list of components was alphabetical. Is there a way to change the order in which they're listed in Storybook?
That's a great question that I don't know the answer to. I'd like to think there's a way. Yes?
So, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at some of the other ways to skin the same cat, but I wonder if, there are evaluation criteria, because obviously the adoption, you probably don't want to experiment too long if you're actually trying to get projects done to evaluate all the different ways.
Yes. And I also want to make sure to repeat the questions for the recording. The first one was if there's a way to impact the order of the components in the storybook. My super useful answer was I don't know. And this one was evaluation criteria for these types of tools. Great question. For something like this, for me, I look at the kind of adoption of the project and issue queue and how many people seem to be using it. But another big selling point for this for me, and Pattern Lab also has some of this as well, is the different JavaScript frameworks it can work with. So there's, like for React, there's something called React Style Guidist, which also looks really nice. But Storybook is something that we can use on a React project, and we can use on a project where Vue was the right choice, and Angular was the right choice. And so having this general concept that our front-enders at our agency can be familiar with is really valuable to me. So that's a big criteria as well. And then beyond that, it's also just, diving in a little bit, making sure it works, and that's what I do anyway. Cool. Any other questions? Great. Thanks, everybody. Yay.